From the Homestead Studios in Santa Clarita, California, it's Just the Tip-Sters with Melissa Morgan.
Elevator music.
If you've got a tip from Melissa, a funny feeling you have about a very unfunny unsolved case, a memory of something important you just now flashed on, how to calm down your 5-year-old after he walked in on your live-in grandma dancing to Back That Ass Up in your living room. Tell us about it by calling the Tipster hotline at 832-TIPSTER. That's 832-847-7837, or send an email to jttipsters@gmail.com. And now here's your host. She's got a big brain, a big heart, and a great big box filled with unicorn headgear, Melissa Morgan.
More cowbell. I do have a large plastic bin filled with unicorn headgear.
Oh, yes, she does.
That is not including the pieces that are strewn randomly around the house that I occasionally pick up when I'm having a bad day and put on my head.
Or the dog finds, she'll come out from underneath the ottoman with a
unicorn headband.
A giant unicorn headband. Yeah.
Well, that was a mouthful of an intro, Producer Mark, and you did a beautiful job. And I believe that Back That Ass Up is the theme song for the pandemic.
You think?
I think it's the perfect pandemic theme song.
I guess, kind of.
You're a fine motherfucker. Won't you back that ass up? Meaning the opposite direction than the way the original artist had hoped it would go. Right. But yeah, I think it's a really good...
toward the wall instead of toward me.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. That's a good one. I really like that. I'm surprised you are aware of that song.
Well, no, you're the one that made me aware of it.
Oh, right.
We were right. As we've discussed in prior episodes, Ms. Morgan is a large fan of classic hip hop.
I am.
Whenever we're in her car with the giant JBL speakers blaring, she's on one of the Sirius XM channels that feature such music.
The Fly.
Yeah, The Fly or
whatever.
Rock the Bells.
Rock the Bells.
Yeah. And there it is.
It's funny, and one of my proudest moments was when you were riding with me in my car, and out of the blue you said, "Is that Tupac?" And I was like, "Oh."
I finally started recognizing.
Yeah, you recognized it without even, recognized his voice without. I was like, this is like the proudest moment. I was like a proud mom. Proudest moment of my life. My husband recognized Tupac just from his voice.
I'd heard enough over the years.
Yeah. You've probably been inundated, which is, there's worse things, right? I mean,
yes,
I could make you listen to like radio involving cooking shows where they only cook seafood. See?
No, you don't really make me listen to radio shows that do that, but sometimes on the television when I'm trying to have dinner, there's
I turn the channel.
Smiling face of Reed Drummond cooking some obscene, weird shit.
Why are you so mean to her? Because I'm making that bruschetta chicken, bitch.
Now that looks good.
You're going to eat it.
About half the stuff she makes looks really good. And then
half.
All right, 60%.
I'm giving her a 75.
It's just, no matter what she makes, I just can't stand that smiling face.
God forbid someone be happy doing what they are doing and love what they're doing. God forbid.
Yeah, fuck that shit.
Fuck that shit. Right. So speaking of being happy.
And back that ass up.
Speaking of being happy doing what you're doing, I found the funniest little blurb in a local Santa Clarita magazine, and it just made me laugh so hard. And it was... unusual wills, and it's a very well done little piece because this person is trying to get you to plan your estate and get your last wishes.
I see. It's somebody selling legal services.
Yes, and a will provides one last chance for the deceased to act upon the living and let them and the world know how they feel. So he has, this attorney has 5 unusual final messages listed. And I didn't know any of these, but they all make kind of some make sense. The first one is Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, was cremated and his remains were launched into space aboard 3 different space missions.
No kidding. I didn't know that.
I did not know that. Mark Gruenwald, who was the executive director of Marvel Comics, requested his ashes be blended with ink and used to print 12-issue miniseries.
Really?
12 issues of a comic has his ashes blended with the ink.
Oh, that's kind of creepy.
That's a little weird, but
Yeah.
I get it. This is funny because I just wonder what happened later, but Countess Carlotta Liebenstein, she was a German countess and she loved her dog more than people, so she left her mansion and her $80 million fortune to Gunther III, her dog. And I wonder what you think Gunther just hired a bunch of Chihuahuas to come over wearing like tutus and play like back that ass up. And,
yeah. Serve them some unpeeled kibble.
Sure. Sure. Unpeeled?
Yeah.
What?
Well,
what are you talking about?
It's the old thing with the
peel a grape?
Unpeeled grapes.
Oh, you're so weird. Okay. Frederick Bauer, who's the inventor of the Pringles can, requested that his cremated remains, part of it be put, and buried in a Pringles can. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. But this is my favorite because this sounds like something producer Mark would do. Charles Vance Miller, he was a Canadian attorney who was known to enjoy a good joke, and he left his Jamaican vacation house in the joint custody of 3 of his friends who hated each other. That's something producer Mark would do.
Good. That's really good. I'm carrying in my briefcase a baggie full of ashes
of your father.
Of my dad.
Every now and then I think
about
about that. Yeah.
Because I got to go. At some point I got to get.
Field.
I got to get on get on Dodger Stadium field and somehow
because you haven't. Part of his remains were scattered on his favorite lane at his bowling alley. Part of it are supposed to go to the desert. Part of it is supposed to be mixed with your mom when she passes and she's cremated, and part of him is supposed to be placed on Dodgers Field by his oldest son, producer Mark. So I hadn't thought about that. You're right, but since the pandemic, you haven't gone out much. It's just, but you would come home from work sometimes, and I'd be like, oh, there's Gary.
Yeah, right. I mean,
in Mark's briefcase.
In my briefcase, and the thing is, I'm gonna have to go on a fireworks night because that's when they they do it on Friday nights when they're at home. They have at least I hope they continue this because that's unless I get some sort of special privilege, I'm not going to get on the field. Then what they do is they have a fireworks show at the end of the game on every Friday night home game. And they let people onto the field to do that. So I'm going to have to sneak the little baggie of ashes with me.
Gary.
And while the fireworks are going and everybody's looking up.
That's actually, there's really such grace in that because Gary was such a fireworksaholic.
Now you're going to make me cry.
Oh, now I'm going to cry too.
That's exact. I hadn't even thought of that because, he was absolutely, he just loved the fire and fireworks and the really dangerous explosive ones that he would go down into Tijuana or over in some state that sold those really expensive ones and shoot them off at the 4th of July.
Drive to Wyoming or Utah or something.
Pyromaniac.
Yeah, total pyro.
Oh, that is, now I really want to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful thing that he would be placed on Dodgers Field, during a big fireworks show. I can't think of anything he would want more than that.
Actually, he wouldn't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So this episode is going to be a couple of episodes. We're still negotiating, producer Mark and I, between a 2 and a 3-part series. But when I started researching it, it was just too much for one episode. There's just no way I could get it all. And I want to get as many of the fine points in because it's such a weird, layered case. And I think I'm a little shocked that these cases aren't, bigger, well-known. And I'm sure they're more well-known by those who, follow the true crime genre. And I'm one of those people. But I just feel like this case is bigger than I remembered and more interesting and bizarre and layered. And I don't know. Maybe I just feel like something involving this case hasn't caught fire yet, but maybe I'm just the one who wasn't paying close enough attention. But it's the case of Derek Todd Lee, the Baton Rouge serial killer. It feels like this is just like kind of a throwaway, and at the same time, a part of another episode in this will be John Gillis, who was a serial killer operating at the same time in Baton Rouge as Derek Todd Lee, and his name is the other Baton Rouge serial killer.
Yeah, this is wow.
It's like, what? So I had actually heard a much better, in my mind, a much better term for Derek Todd Lee, which is like the key collector. And he took keys in very odd ways, which we'll get into. They say every serial killer has a penchant for trophies, and we know, Ted Bundy did, and we know Gary Ridgway did, and we still can't find Joseph James D'Angelo's stash, but he not only had trophies, he would take items from one victim's home and place them in another victim's home, so you would know it was his work.
Man.
Yeah, that was a weird thing that Joseph James D'Angelo did. But
I had forgotten about that.
Yeah, you remember there was like a jar of maraschino cherries taken from one person's home.
That's right.
I mean, just a half-eaten turkey taken from one person's home, placed in another person's home. I mean, very odd behavior. That's for sure. What can you say about someone who thinks they can walk into someone's home and do what they did? But that's another thing that's so interesting about what Derek Todd Lee did. He did so many repetitive actions of what Joseph James D'Angelo did. And we know Joseph James D'Angelo is not the first serial killer. He was, had his own weird MO, but a lot of them apparently are a crossover. That if you think you can take someone's life and that's just your right to do, you do these same behaviors. There's, an Australian serial killer called, that's not Mr. Evil. I can't remember his name now, but they thought at the same time that he was operating as the same time as Joseph James D'Angelo, they thought he may have changed countries. And I guess these MOs are more common as a crossover than I can imagine.
I guess.
It's very interesting when you hear what Derek Todd Lee did. So there are some TV shows that covered his case, kind of. There's one called Mark of a Killer that is on the ID network, and it was very much all about him. But there's that wonderful show called The Killing Fields. It was on the Discovery Channel. That is 2017. They covered him, but kind of almost...
well, it was peripherally.
Yeah,
really.
As an afterthought, really, yeah. Really, Sergeant Rody Sanchez, I think his name was investigating because he had promised this girl's mother that he would not stop. He actually came out of retirement to work on her case, Eugenie Boisfontaine, which they had thought potentially she could have been one of the victims of Derek Todd Lee, but, in this South Louisiana area near the LSU campus. And it's, there's just a lot going on here. So, but none of it seems to have caught fire the way something like I'll Be Gone in the Dark and even The Jinx, some of those shows just catch people's, imagination or curiosity, and they become much more popular. I mean, The Killing Fields was a really well done show, but I barely remembered that Derek Todd Lee was considered a suspect, and they don't have anything to tie him to Eugenie's murder. She was found in a drainage ditch, and there, some of the things that I think that saved. There's a lot that happened that should have been pointed toward Derek Todd Lee and much sooner. Many women could have, still been alive if they had paid attention. But I think some of the things that happened is he just caught some lucky breaks, because it wasn't that he was, a genius by any means at all. But a book that I haven't read, by the way, came out in 2006 called I've Been Watching You. And it was co-written by a journalist from the South Louisiana area named Susan Mustafa, and also the special prosecutor for one of the murders that Derek Todd Lee was eventually convicted of, Tony Clayton. So they combined to write this book, I've Been Watching You. And that's another thing that Derek Todd Lee did that was so close to what Joseph James D'Angelo did is that he would stalk and watch and prepare for his victims, finding out their schedules. I mean, so it's hard for me to say, look, he was tested, and was supposed to have had an IQ of between 75 and 79. And, it was difficult for him to do well in school, blah, blah, blah. But he got away with killing at least 8 women that we know of, and probably more that are not attributed to him because of luck or timing, or in one instance, Hurricane Andrew. I mean, it's, he got away with a lot before he was caught eventually by DNA, but he got away with, in my mind, too much. He was given way too long of a leash, when you'll see, because he had a long rap sheet of really bizarre behavior. But I thought that the back flap of the book, I'll Be Watching You, was done by a very shrewd editor or PR person. And it's really interesting. And it says, since 1985, more than 60 cases of missing and murdered women remain unsolved in southern Louisiana, and the rumors began to fly. The killer was a white male on a white Chevy pickup truck. The killer liked dark-haired women. The killer attended LSU. The killer was a professor at LSU. The killer had sought out all of the victims at a college bar at the intersection of Stanford Avenue and Acadian Thruway. The killer was a police officer. The killer played a tape recording of a baby crying outside of his victim's door. That's how he got in. The killer worked at a local BMW shop. Everyone knew someone who had seen a man peeping into their windows. The East Baton Rouge Parish Sheriff's Office began hosting classes for women, teaching them how to defend themselves against attacks. Sales of pepper spray skyrocketed. Store owners couldn't keep it on their shelves. The Advocate, a Baton Rouge newspaper, began dividing its headlines between reports on the victims and the investigation and reports on the West Nile virus, which had been taking numerous lives in the area. Bumper stickers appeared on the backs of vehicles. Baton Rouge women packing heat and wearing DEET. Men in white trucks no longer smiled at pretty girls while stopped at red lights. Women loaded their guns and learned how to use them. There were no more late-night shopping trips to Walmart. No more leaving doors unlocked. No more sitting on porches after dark. One man had control of the city.
Wow. That is a good blurb.
That's a pretty all-encompassing back flap of this book. And it's got great reviews. Like I said, I have not read it, but it's got great reviews. The only thing I'm familiar with are the TV shows that covered the case. But this research I've been doing is pretty overwhelming. And that was why I felt like it needed to be more than one episode, because it's just so much. And it's got a lot of tentacles. This case has a lot of tentacles. One of the things that struck me so hard in the gut in the Mark of a Killer episode is that there were laminated signs nailed to trees around southern Louisiana that said, "Killer on the loose, please be careful, love mom."
Oh, wow.
I know. It was a lovely campaign that, someone felt they needed to do to remind women to be safe. And here's the thing. You couldn't anticipate what was going to happen. You couldn't carry enough mace because he kidnapped you from your home. He would find a way to get in. He was probably thwarted at some point, but he would find you in your doorway. He would find you at your place of work. I mean, you were kidnapped out of your home. And I mean, how do you
you can't really defend that, because when you're at home, you feel safe. You're not going to be carrying a can of mace with you.
To the front door. I do have to say the part of the blurb that says, he had a tape of a baby crying, that actually is a misnomer. He did not use that as a tool, but it's fascinating that rumor that started in Louisiana saying that this is how this guy's getting in, it was used in an episode of Criminal Minds. it's interesting that something that was,
wow.
yeah, a fictional rumor turned out to be an interesting plot point in an episode of Criminal Minds where a man had a tape, an audio tape of a baby crying, and like someone had left a baby on their front porch, and that's how a woman would open the door, and then he'd push his way in. But
that is frightening.
It
really is.
But you'll hear part of his MO. He wasn't as sophisticated as someone who'd use a tape. He just had. I am shocked, actually, but let's get into this. This is going to be a multi-part episodes involving Derek Todd Lee and Sean Gillis, but we're going to start with Derek Todd Lee because that's where I started. And the Baton Rouge Serial Killer is his name, and this part is coming from a really interesting author named Charles Montaldo, and he had written for something called thoughtco.com. He's a really interesting writer and does a great job of sort of lining up a timeline for Derek Todd Lee. So he was born in 1968, and his father was mentally ill. His mother eventually divorced him after he was put in a mental institution because he had attempted to kill her, his mom, Florence Lee. But Florence remarried. Derek was very small, and she remarried quickly, a man named Coleman Barrow, and he took responsibility for Derek and her other kids, her sisters, and treated them like they were his own. He was a really good dad. They, spent time teaching her kids the importance of education and of the Bible. They went to church. He grew up in this little area of South Louisiana where, he played with his neighbors, and he had extended family cousins that were his playmates. And he, wasn't really into school because he wasn't that smart. He struggled academically, and his sister was a lot smarter, even though she was a year younger. And, like I said, his IQ is supposed to have been estimated between 75 and 79. But, so he didn't have good grades. Okay. It doesn't mean, you're going to turn in to be a monster. What does lead someone to think you might have issues is that by the time you're 11, you're caught peeping in windows of little girls in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that would seem to be a little worrisome.
Yeah, when you're 11, you're caught peeping in little girls' windows. You're also known to be the neighborhood asshole who tortures dogs and cats.
Okay, well, that... yeah.
So he's 13, and he's arrested for something called simple burglary. He's known to the police because he's a voyeur, but they don't really pick up on the fact that, he's got a problem. Well, he's 16, and his anger comes out. He pulls a knife on a little boy during a fight, and then he's charged with second-degree murder at the age of 16. Attempted second-degree murder, at the age of 16. So he's getting a rap sheet, but nothing seems to stick. He seems to be like the Teflon serial killer. He has a huge rap sheet, a really long rap sheet. He does a lot of time, but short sentences for things that should have required a lot longer sentences, and more people would be alive. It's just...
Here we go again with this. I mean, it's just so frustrating.
And when you find out that there was a task force developed because he was amping up, and what turns out is a chief of police of a small parish, David McDavid, fucking put the pieces together. But that's later on down the road. It needs that one... You can have all the task forces you want, and I'm a big believer in more eyes and more ears on a case, the better. But one person who takes the time, a little local cop who takes the time to put the pieces together and go, I think it's this guy. Yeah. I think we ought to get his DNA.
Yeah.
After he looks back and sees, he's arrested at the age of 17 for being a peeping Tom. Somehow they keep him out of juvenile detention. I don't know how. But he sort of, wanders around his life, probably doing a lot worse shit than we know. And then 1988, he marries a woman named Jacqueline Sims. They have 2 kids together, Derek Todd Lee Jr. and Doris Lee. So he kind of drifts around in his life. He kind of tries to be a responsible father. He, works hard at a construction job. It's like, I have these 2 kids. I take them out on these, weekend, outings. And then there's this other part of him who has all these extramarital affairs. He will occasionally get dressed up and go out to bars. And Jacqueline knew about his infidelity, but she loved him. It's later on kind of proven she probably had some Stockholm syndrome because she was afraid.
Oh.
Yeah. She, tried to leave him a few times, but, she never really got away with it. Got away from him. She never really got away from him. She would always come back. In 1996, Jacqueline's father was killed in a plant explosion, and she was awarded $250,000, which, of course, Derek Todd Lee uses to his advantage. He now, wears like fancy clothes. He buys multiple cars, and he takes a full-time girlfriend named Cassandra Green. And at one point, he even convinces Jacqueline to let Cassandra live with them. So they're all 3 living together.
Wow. That does sound like Stockholm Syndrome.
It does. I mean, she has, the 2 kids with him, and then Cassandra gives birth to a son named Derek Lee in July of 1999. And we're going to find out, unfortunately, in 2018, Derek turns out to have a murder on him anyway, that'll be later on, but I don't want to say these things are hereditary because Derek's situation is very different. But so he has this, it is, you'll see, I promise you it's very different. It's not pleasant, but he is a different creature than his father, but still, at the age of 19, he's, anyway, so the 3 of them are living together in this house, and he has to go back to work because he, was run out of his wife's money for the loss of her father. So this is how I don't understand that he wasn't moved up the list when women started being murdered and disappeared from their homes. This is the case that I don't know how this wasn't considered more closely. So in June of 1999, Colette Walker, she's a 36-year-old woman who lives in St. Francisville. She filed stalking charges against Derek Todd Lee after he muscled his way into her apartment and tried to convince her they should date. She didn't know him, and she's like, look, you have to go. You have to go. And she got him out of her apartment. He left his phone number and said, call me. A few days later, a friend who lived near Colette asked her about Derek Todd Lee because she said, I've seen him lurking around your apartment. So after he's muscled his way in and left his phone number, he's still coming back and hanging around.
This is all so fucking creepy.
It's so awful. Colette catches him peeping through her window and calls the police. And even with his history of being a peeping Tom, of his other assault arrests, he did a really little amount of time on the charges of stalking and unlawful entry. He got a plea bargain and he pled guilty and received probation.
Yeah. At this point, how many different arrests had he had? I mean,
at this time, I'm going to guess at least a dozen.
Yeah, that's at that point, it's ridiculous. Okay, I'm going to calm down now.
Right. So against all orders by the court, he goes trying to find Colette and peeping and got furious when he found out she had moved. I mean, I don't know what you expect.
That's right. I mean, okay.
Right. So his person he's stalking has moved away from him. He has to go back to work, and he's getting stressed. And these, stressors are the things that you hear about from profilers that make someone, snap and amp up their killing. So his finances are kind of tight, and he's arguing a lot with the secondary girlfriend, Cassandra, and they fight so much that it escalates to where he beats her. So she starts court proceedings to get a protective order to get him away from her so he can't get near her. 3 days after the protective order, he catches up with her in a parking lot and assaults her, violently assaults her. Cassandra keeps pressing charges and his probation is revoked. So he spent a year in prison and was released in February of 2001.
Of course he was.
He was placed under house arrest and was wearing the monitoring equipment. In May of 2001, he's found guilty of violating the terms of his parole because he removed the equipment.
Oh, God.
Instead of getting his probation revoked, he is given a slap on the hand and doesn't do any more time. And he's out. And then it starts to get really bad. He kills numerous women between 2001 and 2003 before he is eventually caught. And one of the things about this series of episodes is that producer Mark said, when I was trying to describe it to him, and as I said, we were negotiating how we were going to do this, he said, I like the fact that you'll be going forward and backward because it's like a Quentin Tarantino movie. And things like that bother me the way I'm not a master of storytelling the way Quentin Tarantino is. So going backward and forward is difficult for me. But at this point, he has been doing a lot of damage already for almost 10 years. And it takes a long time to put things together. And the things he did before were bad, but not all of the victims are attributed to him until later. But after 2001, after he really should have been incarcerated for attacking Cassandra and removing his ankle monitor, he is allowed out and he does the worst of his damage at that time. This is, we're going backward a little bit here. This is really odd, and I want to include this because this is before the murders that are attributed to him happen. But these were clues. There were signs that should have been followed up on. So he committed his first odd attack in my mind, other than, pushing in poor Colleen Walker into her home. April 2nd of 1993, a couple, Michelle Chapman and her boyfriend, are in their car making out in a graveyard. He shines a flashlight in the car, blinds them, and then gets in the back seat, and then proceeds to take a 6-foot harvesting machete and hacks at the couple. Now, the only thing that saves them, my hand to God, someone is watching out, is a police officer sees a car in the cemetery with its dome light on and pulls up right in front. Derek Todd Lee leaves the back seat of the car wearing a hoodie, carrying a machete, and comes back and takes the keys out of the car and then leaves again.
With the cop there.
Well, the cop is on his way to catch him.
Oh, I see.
But
I get
missed
it.
him.
I get it.
But he had time to come back and get the keys.
Oh, my God.
Out of the car. So Michelle and her boyfriend are, hospitalized and, pretty bad attack with a machete. And it takes her 6 years before they show her a lineup and Lee is in the lineup. But that's 1999.
Oh, God.
But guess what? The statute of limitations on his charges have expired.
Oh, God. Oh, man.
Yeah. Statute of limitations on hacking up 2 people with a 6-foot machete. Hacking 2 people in their car and leaving only when the cops show up, but not before taking the keys.
And the statute had expired.
Yep. So they can't charge him. She picks him out. She knows it's him immediately. He has a very distinctive kind of round head and a distinctive look. He's not an unattractive man. He, as he got older, he looks a little oddly bloated, which we'll figure out is probably a health issue. But yeah, so there just were, there were numerous times in my mind that he could have been stopped way before it got to how bad it had to get in such a short period of time. And the thing is, there are probably so many more victims than we will ever know. A few that have been suspected to have been his work, and yet one woman, her body has never been found, but she was taken out of her place of business. An older woman. It's, I think, I'm not saying law enforcement fucked up, but law enforcement fucked up. And not one division. I think quite a few opportunities spread out over time and over different jurisdictions could have and should have been taken. And this was, to turn into a serial killer, given the opportunity to turn into a serial killer in a small area. I'm not saying Baton Rouge is small, but he kept local.
Yeah, let's be clear. Baton Rouge is not what I would call a small city,
right?
But it's not a big city either. It's like it's like an average sized city, but it's still amazing to me that he worked in such a small area, a relatively small area.
And part of this is put down to communications between detectives in different cities was a rarity back then. It's one of the things I think is so odd that, it's like, well, this is my jurisdiction. And I get it. I guess part of me gets it. I really don't. But, okay, you guys handle this part and we'll handle this part and never the twain shall meet. Why in an area where there are different parishes, different jurisdictions, this is a question no one's going to be able to answer. Why was communication not something that you did? And then you end up having to form a multi-agency task force, which, by the way, doesn't really do it. They end up finding, oh shit, we've got a lot more murders that seem to be connected. And they end up with more murders on their books because they realize that all of these things are here and connected. But honest to God, and they got a huge congratulations when he was finally arrested. Honest to God, I'm not saying it's one man, but David McDavid, kind of one man.
Man, I can't wait to hear about that.
Because
that's absolutely right. It seems to me it always comes down to one person, whether it's a Michelle McNamara or Paul Holes or somebody like that, one person to kind of just go, well, let's hold on, take a breath, look at this from 30,000 feet, and take some fucking time, and not just be looking at what's right in front of me, but look a little deeper,
Right.
So anyway, I can't wait to hear about Mr. McDavid or
David McDavid,
yeah, right.
Which I hate that his parents did that to him, but he's just this solid, dude. He's just this solid dude cop that is just like, I think this is the guy. I think we should look at this guy. And he went on his own theories because of Derek Todd Lee's history. He put that together with what was happening now, and he's like, look, we got a handful of guys that can fit this. This guy fits better than most. And believe me, there were things that did not help the investigation. And I'm not completely saying, oh my God, the police were just sitting with their thumbs up their butt. It wasn't that. There was a lot that made this case more difficult. Profilers failed miserably, and not to their own, fault really. Derek Todd Lee used different MOs. He would, catch people in their home. He would catch people in their work. He would catch them, in their driveway. He wouldn't use one manner of death. He would stab, he would bludgeon, he would strangle. Sometimes they were raped, sometimes they were not. I mean, he was tricky in the way that somebody who doesn't know, people are profiling you, and you're supposed to use one signature as your killer because you want the credit for your quote unquote work. He was tricky in that he didn't know that was a thing that he was supposed to do. So he changed it up. The only thing he did that was pretty consistent is either he would take a cell phone or a set of keys. The keys, I think, is the interesting part, because numerous times there were a victim was murdered in her home. Everything was there. It wasn't a robbery. The only thing taken was the keys out of the car or off the wall if they were hanging. The car was left, but the keys were gone. To me, that's a pretty good indicator it's the same guy.
Yeah, you think?
Look, hindsight's 2020. Who the fuck am I, right?
Okay. Well, law enforcement's supposed to be smarter than that.
Right. Well, and they are. I mean, let's face it, they are. But it is interesting what producer Mark said, that sometimes there's just one person, and it's really never one person. Like you mentioned Michelle McNamara, you mentioned Paul Holes. And Paul Holes, all credit to him for using an amazing tool like genetic genealogy. But it was a huge group of people that.
Oh, I know.
I know you know.
But
I'm just saying.
But there's, and I probably was a little too harsh, right? I mean, I understand. I understand that law enforcement is. I mean, it's a crazy job, and you can't always focus on everything. It's just that it does take, I think, sometimes people who, especially on the difficult cases, somebody who's willing to just stop, dig in, not expect an answer right away, but actually look at all possibilities and look deeper into the background of the crimes. I mean, I think that's just what solves these things. What Michelle McNamara did with the Golden State Killer, I'm sorry, there's a direct line from the day she became addicted to that case to the day he was arrested. There's a direct line. I mean, you can't deny that.
And I understand why the best writers, the crime writers, the best people in law enforcement become obsessed, because they, are trying to get into the mind of a killer. I mean, that's what profiling is all about. That's what people in law enforcement, whether, it's been noted through history, to catch a criminal, sometimes you have to think like them, and not just a criminal, but a murderer, and a specific type of murderer, a sexually motivated murderer, a spree killer. You have to think like them, and that would be a very difficult place to put your brain to think like that. And you summed it up perfectly. People like Michelle McNamara, people like Paul Holes have to make it an obsession. It has to become an obsession with them because the killer has an obsession. And you may not have to think exactly like the killer, but what you have to do is be really fucking on point with your obsession. And your obsession has to be, I'm going to fucking find you, you fucker.
Right.
You may not have to think exactly like a killer, but what you have to do is be obsessed with what the killer has done and consider what they may do, so that you can find them and stop them. And I believe it with all my heart that is why the large percentage of people get into law enforcement, is to catch the bad guy. That is what every detective I've spoken to that, has my respect has said. Why did you get in this business? To catch the bad guy. I mean, it's just simple and plain. You want to catch the bad guy. And there were things that were going against law enforcement. There was a lot of reporting of a white man in a white Chevy pickup truck seen near where the women disappeared or the women were murdered. Until recently, there, was a theory that, black serial killers don't exist. All serial killers are white males. All serial killers pick from their own race, which, most of Derek Todd Lee's victims were white. There was one black woman. Everyone else was white with dark hair. Most serial killers use a signature method of killing people, so they get, credit. Derek Todd Lee used different methods. So there were things going against law enforcement that, but you're right. What it took was someone like David McDavid to say, you know what? I get it. He doesn't fit this, parameter, but why don't we look at this guy? Why don't we take a look at this guy? I mean, there was in 2002, there was a composite sketch of a suspected serial killer, and it was a white male with like a long nose and a long face and long hair. Looked nothing like Derek Todd Lee or even Sean Gillis. It didn't look like either of them. So, there was a lot of phone calls and tips that, they were bogged down following up, these tips that just turned out to not be anything.
Yeah.
It's a little heartbreaking. So we know the origins of Derek Todd Lee and how he got started and how he wasn't stopped, in my mind, soon enough. And in the next episode or two, we're going to talk about what happened, who his victims were that didn't survive, going back and forth in time, and yet we'll end up at the same place and more cowbell.
Remember, if you'd like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/justthetipsters.